Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
They're not aliens, extraterrestrial or dimensional, nor are they Chinese weather balloons. They're the atmospheric beasts that have lived alongside and above us since the dawn of mankind. Recent increases in pollutants, particularly the large amounts of chlorofluorocarbons rogue industrialists in China have been releasing the past few years, have caused their translucent, squishy bodies to turn white and ossify. The weakening of the Gulf Stream has caused them to float far lower over North America than they are used to. They're members of the Salpidae family, making them chordates like us. They're more closely related to us than the ants and spiders in your house. The Montana balloon was here to learn more about them, and how we can save them from the illness our disharmony has wrought on them.
So basically Nope was not so soft disclosure. This does not explain the secrecy behind the subject unless they are intelligent, very intelligent beings and not just sentient flying jelly.
Their metabolic processes redirect heat and infrared light in the atmosphere upwards into space. By my estimations, killing one is the global warming equivalent of about 5 billion metric tons of CO2. And in 1900 there were thousands. Nuclear testing and pollution released during World War II and the industrial boom afterwards did a number on them. In their Cold War haze, the U.S. military began exterminating the ailing and dying who were living at aircraft altitudes. Basically, the U.S. military contributed to about a third of modern climate change by killing most of these things. And they recognize climate change as a national security threat and are very embarrassed.
If you want to see something eerily similar right where you're at, just use a cam with 940 nanometers infrared and you can see little airfish or jellies moving around. They're not orbs, dust, or reflections. They're literally swimming in the air and never collide with anything. Or I don't give a f.
It was 4:05 a.m. on September 20th, 1977. Something serious was happening over the skies of Petrozavodsk. A group of dock workers on the early shift that morning say they saw a blinding light emerge from the direction of Lake Onega in northwest Russia. As it approached Petrozavodsk, the light took on the appearance of a glimmering jellyfish, before slowing to a hover and unleashing a salvo of ultra-thin beams of light. The dock workers were left wondering what they had seen. Some were concerned they were witnessing a nuclear attack. This was, after all, the height of the Cold War. But that did not explain what came next. After 12 puzzling minutes, the shining object transformed into a bright semicircle and jetted off back toward Lake Onega. Rather than disappearing over the horizon, it appeared to veer upward, before punching a burning red hole in the clouds and disappearing into the abyss. No one died, and the United States, it seemed, was not involved. The Petrozavodsk jellyfish was not the first time a UFO had been spotted over the territory of the Soviet Union, but few sightings had ever been corroborated by so many people. Policemen, sailors, an ambulance crew, and even a reporter for the Informaziono Agentstwo Rossi TASS or TASS news agency all claimed to have seen the object. The TASS reporter filed his story 3 days later under the headline, "A Strange Natural Phenomena Over Karelia." Neighboring governments became alarmed, suspecting the Soviets had tested a new type of weapon. They demanded an explanation from Moscow, but Soviet leaders were apparently just as baffled. Officials even turned to the Academy of Sciences, the highest collection of scientific minds in the communist bloc, for an explanation. The Academy had no satisfactory answer, concluding that the UFO was a real physical phenomenon that required further study. As Soviet UFO enthusiasts began promoting their own interpretations, the Kremlin convened an unprecedented meeting of military and scientific experts. They all agreed the UFO issue was too big to ignore and resolved to launch a state investigation into the phenomenon.
Might have seen a high-altitude siphonophore out the window and got freaked out. Modern scientists deny their existence, but they're basically primitive jelly creatures that are simple, light enough to live in the atmosphere and feed on pollen and such.
I know I'm late, but would you happen to have any more info about high-altitude/atmospheric life? It's something that I've always felt just had to be out there somewhere. We already know microorganisms can be found up there, so primitive animals, like jellyfish, possibly could make their way up there.
Sure. Atmospheric beasts are pretty fascinating, even if we know very little about them. Flying insects, birds, bats aren't the only animals that can fly. Arachnid spiders are known to migrate via letting the wind catch their spider webs. This process is called ballooning or kiting. However, they're not really classified as true atmospheric beasts because they only use high altitudes to basically migrate. Of course, many plants use high altitudes wind to disperse seeds or pollen, which is the most common food source for the higher altitude animals. As you said, it's mainly primitive animals that are that high altitude. True atmospheric life forms are limited to cnidaria and are usually limited to colonial organisms like long strands of siphonophores. Comb jellies and possibly tunicates have also been thought to live in these high altitudes, but it's mostly speculative. Star jelly, or astral jelly, is a gelatinous substance usually found in grass or on tree branches. Basically, a jelly creature's body is especially adapted to living in high altitudes. Basically, because the air is thinner up there, if a jelly falls to the ground somehow, it gets crushed and condensed into this jelly-looking substance. Kind of like how deep-sea animals will get all floppy and die when you bring them up to the surface. Star jelly has been a thing for centuries, and in the past it was even treated as some form of alchemical substance and used to treat blemishes. This stuff is pretty much the closest you're going to get to actually obtaining one of these atmospheric beasts in physical form. And of course, there's not a lot you can learn from a pile of white snot. I really am not sure how one would try to study or observe these things. They're so insanely fragile and nearly invisible.
Does this explain the substance that fell on Oakville, Washington?
Probably. Even the most popular theory explanation is that they are some form of jellyfish, which lines up well with atmospheric beast stuff. There's a lot of stories of weird shit raining from the sky, frogs, fish, etc. The middle to upper troposphere even has a microbiome of microorganisms, mostly bacteria, that have potentially important impacts on the hydrological cycle, clouds, and climate. Several bacterial plant pathogens are known to promote heterogeneous freezing of ice through the action of an outer membrane protein. Given that there are thriving ecosystems at the bottom of the ocean, and even extremophile bacteria that live in pools of boiling sulfur, I think that primitive animals living in the upper troposphere is pretty believable. Understanding and research in this subject is severely lacking. Most studies to date on atmospheric microbiomes are restricted to sample gatherings near the Earth's surface, such as mountaintops. The microbial communities at high altitudes and in air masses over marine oceanic regions remain poorly characterized, mostly due to difficulties associated with obtaining representative samples of sufficient biomass.
The classic vision of Earth from space is a bluish planet painted with an ever-changing, deeply textured wash of white clouds. Often we peer between the gaps in these clouds, looking for the recognizable continents and oceans of the surface, because that's our domain and the obvious domain of life. But life doesn't stop at the rocks and liquids of Earth. It permeates the atmosphere too. Birds, insects, plants and fungi all exploit the world-spanning fluid of the air and its currents and turbulence. It also seems that the vast microbial biosphere extends well into this domain. On the face of things, it's not surprising that there are single-celled organisms floating through the air. At scales of a few micrometers, a bacterium, for instance, is easily lofted into the jumble of atmospheric molecules. Plants, oceans, land, and human urban areas are constantly spewing microbes. Soil erosion lofts, soil microbes. Ocean evaporation lofts, marine microbes. And every coughing, spluttering animal helps inject microscopic organisms into the air. Atmospheric sampling suggests that there is an appreciable biological load at least up and into the bottom of Earth's stratosphere at around 7 kilometers altitude at polar regions, all the way up to about 20 kilometers at the equator, with seasonal variation. These measurements are not easy, in part because the number of organisms in a given volume is quite low by surface standards, between around 100 to 10,000 cells in every cubic centimeter, but also because of the sheer genomic diversity. A big question is whether or not microbial species that frequently end up airborne also take advantage of this, or indeed have evolved to exploit not just the global transport system of the atmosphere, but some of its other properties. So-called rain-making bacteria have been in the news over the years. Any kind of precipitation of water tends to involve the nucleation or seeding of droplets or crystals of condensing water vapor. Since biological particulates, not just things like bacteria, but also biologically produced compounds like dimethyl sulfide made by phytoplankton that turns into atmospheric sulfate particles, make up somewhere between 20% and 70% of atmospheric aerosols, it seems that life can play a big role. Indeed, there is evidence that phytoplankton blooms in the Southern Ocean can seed their own cloud cover. Globally, it looks like biological aerosols boost cloud droplet numbers by as much as 60%. But it also seems that lofted species are doing more than just physically interacting with Earth's hydrological cycle, a big enough deal in its own right. There is evidence that there are metabolically active bacteria in the atmosphere. This was not a sure thing. Microbes tend to work best together in physically associated colonies mingling with other species. Over the years, researchers have seen that certain cloud-borne species, if cultured in a lab, could certainly be altering the chemistry of atmospheric compounds involving carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. Other studies that attempt to measure the in situ metabolisms suggest that species in the family of Acetobacteriaceae could be active. These ferment ethanol to acetic acid, and ethanol is, perhaps surprisingly, typically present in Earth's atmosphere as part of the complex chemical mix that circulates around us. Other species utilize sunlight and use simple organic acid compounds to grow, the kinds of organic acids that wildfires produce. As with much cutting-edge science, there are more questions than answers at the moment. But there seems to be evidence that airborne, metabolically active microbes are directly engaged in the core biogeochemical cycles of the Earth, churning through organic compounds as they float around the planet. Just as it took us a long time to recognize the ubiquity and scale of the subsurface biosphere of our world, we may have to further expand biology's scope to include the rich but largely invisible terrain of the air above our heads.
My wife and I witnessed a flying, more like swimming through the air, jellyfish over the 5 Freeway in Southern California several years back. Suffice it to say, it was quite a surprise. These creatures are not unintelligent and represent one of many rather exotic and ancient forms of intelligence on this planet. These types of creatures are not unknown in occult circles. It is said there are some egregoric-type jellies that can be as large as cities, hidden from sight. They feed off of thought and emotion. Some UFO sightings amount to sightings of such flying jellyfish, pyrosomes, and amoeba, which give off a bioluminescent light to attract prey. Our planet is home and host to a whole variety of intricate, interesting life forms currently unknown or suppressed. From the depths of our oceans to hidden astral spiders, shadow beings, and other creatures in our homes. There is life on every level of our reality, from our skin to the space in between cells to the air, through the spectrum of light. Life is ubiquitous, common, endless in its expressions.
A significant sighting of an apparently biological UFO occurred in Portugal on the 2nd of November 1959. Around midday, in the Escola Industrial e Comercial de Evora, the dean, Professor Joaquim Guedes do Amaral, was called to the front yard to witness a flying object of unknown origin. It was a particularly sunny and cloudless day, allowing for good visibility. He and the others witnessed a flying round object going slowly from east to west. The dean then went to his office to use a telescope to observe the object better. He saw a round light blue elliptic body that increased and decreased in size and accelerated but also stopped mid-air. A few minutes later, a second bigger object appeared as well, approaching the first one. It seemed to move in an undulatory way, similar to Medusozoa, sea jellies. Both objects gained altitude and disappeared quickly into the sky. Immediately afterwards, angel hair, as it is commonly called, began falling from the sky. This angel hair, perhaps a parallel to the star jelly phenomenon also commonly associated with UFOs, was an agglomerate of filaments, almost spider silk-like with a white coloration that seemed to dissipate quickly, especially in contact with human body heat. A couple hours prior, these same filaments were observed in the Sintra Air Base, 125 kilometers, 77 miles, west-northwest of Evora, by pilot Conceição e Silva, future Chief of State of the Portuguese Air Force. The angel hair was said to be sticky, and it rained on Evora for a few hours, much longer than the few minutes it did in Sintra, according to witnesses. This allowed the dean, Professor Amaral, to collect a sample for a closer look. During his observation, he detected among the filaments a tiny organism 4 millimeters in length, formed by a central nucleus and 10 tentacles, covered by a gelatinous, transparent, slightly yellowish substance. Professor Amaral was also friends with Conceição e Silva's father, a professor at the Navy School and associate member of the French Astronomical Society. Thus, Amaral contacted him, still unsure of what to make of this event and in hopes of finding answers. They put the slide containing the sample under microscope and spectroscope, finding nothing that could be conclusively tied to known organisms except for a sodium line, which is a common element. It seemed to react to being compressed in the microscope slide as it stretched when under physical pressure, perhaps suggesting an animal rather than vegetable trait. Amaral, not wanting to give up, contacted other professors to try and reach a conclusion. One of the biologists asked to take a crack at the case said that the closest being in resemblance to the organism might be Coelenterata, but still, it could not be classified by her then current biological knowledge. The cellular biologist, Carlos Azevedo, which had been originally asked by Amaral about the organism, compared the organism to starfish, describing it as a decoradial body, seemingly with no cellular organization and not unicellular. In a later documentary episode focused on this case, produced by Portuguese state TV RTP2 in cooperation with the C-Tech at the Fernando Pessoa University. Due to the polemics of the phenomenon and the contemporary political and social climate of Portugal, then under the new state regime, this case was not talked about much and brought some negative light to Gomes do Amaral's career. Thus he decided to give up his private pursuit and gave the sample to the Faculty of Science at the University of Lisbon for further studies and analysis. Not much is known about what happened afterwards, as any documentation, alongside the sample, was destroyed in a huge fire in the university in 1978. This sighting was unusual, not just among the atmospheric beast study, but in cryptozoology at large due to the huge amount of witnesses, including several respected members of society, a military report confirming the events, photographic and journalistic evidence, and most importantly physical evidence which is alleged confirm the existence of an unknown organism. There were also 2 other events in Portugal, in Alfém and Montargil in the 1970s and 1990s, which might be classified as biological UFOs due to the seemingly gelatinous texture of the observed phenomenon, suggesting perhaps a geographical hotspot for these creatures.
A strange jellyfish-shaped object spotted hanging in the sky over Norway may have been caused by light from the aurora being bounced off a space satellite. If proven, it will be the first known case of a satellite reflecting the northern lights. The mysterious phenomenon was photographed last week by amateur photographer Per Arne Milkalsen over Andenes, Norway. The photographer became fascinated with aurorae after working at a rocket launch site in the far north of Norway for 25 years. The northern lights are often visible here because it is so close to the North Pole. Aurorae are caused by the interaction of the solar wind with Earth's magnetic field, and so are particularly prevalent at the poles where the magnetic forces are strongest. Mr. Mikkelsen told reporters, "I have never seen an object like this before, and I'm eager to find an explanation to the phenomenon." The photographer first assumed the odd optical effect was a spot on his camera lens, but after he posted his photographs on spaceweather.com, he was inundated with emails from interested experts from around the world. Lead scientist Truls Linn Hansen from Tromsø Geophysical Observatory said he doubted the picture, taken on January 20th, was due to a simple camera fault. He told reporters that the phenomenon has the same greenish color as the northern lights. However, Mr. Hansen said it was unlikely the northern lights could create the optical effect on its own. Instead, the aurora might be bouncing off an external source like a satellite. In this way, it would act like an iridium flare. The flares are created by sunlight reflecting off iridium satellites. They appear as bright white flashes in the sky. One problem with this theory is that the light intensity from the northern lights is 100,000 times weaker than the sunlight. But Mr. Hansen said this did not exclude the satellite reflection hypothesis. The intensity of an intense aurora is not far from the intensity of moonlight, he said. And the jellyfish phenomenon is also quite small. apparently many orders of magnitude down compared to the solar iridium flares. But why is it green? One should think it would be white or yellow if it was a reflection from a satellite. So while I am not yet fully convinced it was a satellite, one cannot rule this out.
On Monday, October 19, 1998, 4 military radar stations in Hebei Province, China, reported the presence of an unidentified blip hovering above a military flight training school in Changzhou. Once authorities determined that the intruder was not a military or civilian flight, Colonel Li, the base commander, ordered a Zhangzhou 6 jet fighter to take off and intercept the phenomenon. At least 140 people on the ground saw the object. To observers at the base, the phenomenon first appeared to be a small star, and then grew larger and larger, perhaps as it descended to a lower altitude, the report said. They described an object with a mushroom or jellyfish-shaped object with a bottom covered with bright dangling lights. The crew of the Zhangzhou 6 interceptor consisted of a pilot and a radar officer. The 2 officers said the object clearly resembled depictions they had seen in foreign science fiction films. When they got within 4,000 meters, 13,000 feet, of the phenomenon over Qing County, it abruptly shot upward, easily evading subsequent attempts to get closer. It appeared to be toying with the fighter by repeatedly outdistancing it, and then reappearing right above it, the report said. The pilot requested permission to fire on the phenomenon with the plane's automatic 20mm cannon. He was denied permission to shoot by ground control and was told to continue to pursue and observe the object. The pilot broke off pursuit at an altitude of 12,000 meters, 39,600 feet, when the jet began running low on fuel. The phenomenon then disappeared before 2 more modern Chinese fighter planes could arrive in the area.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.
There's also a Rumble archive as a backup.